Oh, hello, everyone.
Recording progress.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to see you all here. That you brave the elements, the hot weather here in DC. We have a nice little group of people here, and I know it's quite a few online too. So we welcome you all. This is our regular monthly talk story event that we've been. I'm Stan Liu. I'm an 1882 Foundation program director. We're located here in Washington, DC, and we originated the event and the organization around 2012, right here in Chinatown, DC. And every month we've been doing this we were doing this every month live here in Chinatown until the pandemic hit. And then so we've been on virtually since March 2020. And so this year we started doing some hybrid presentations, and this is a hybrid presentation, combination of a live audience plus those of you who are online. And so I appreciate your attendance and your support for us. Now we are live streaming, I believe, on Facebook and recording. So if those of you who are online, if you're uncomfortable about being on camera and being recorded, turn your camera off and use the chat box function to communicate with us. The audience will be muted and until maybe the question and answer period or the open discussion, and then you can be unmuted and speak up at that time when you raise your hand. But ask your questions on the chat, and we're going to be monitoring the chat and attend to your questions as appropriate. All right, like I said before, 1882 Foundation is dedicated to promoting, uncovering, understanding, and sharing our American stories. A regular feature of what we do is in the DC AAPI community since 2012. It's a gathering of our community, our friends, and our allies to share stories of our lives, our heritage, history, hopes and ambitions, trials and tribulations. But we find that the strength of our community lies in the power of the stories we share with each other. Now we invite all of you to partner in partnership with us with your participation and support. Our website is 1882foundation.org. Now we have many partners, collaborators, and co-conspirators. Among the chief ones, maybe, our long-standing partners have been OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, CACA, which is Chinese American Citizens Alliance, the DC Chinatown Service Center, which is associated with the Chinatown Community Church, and the Chinese American Museum here in DC. And today we are pleased to present another meaningful event. This comes from a group of students from our cohort of summer interns at the 1882 Foundation. Now this has been an amazing cohort. I'm very pleased with them. We all are an 1882 Foundation. They've really brought in new energy and ideas to our mission activities, and we're real proud of it. 6 of them worked all summer on our talk story and literature corner team, and have produced today's event. And I'm real anxious to see this and participate with them on this, because I know they put a lot of good work into it. And the 6 members of the team are, 3 of them are in live with us in person. 3 will be remote with us. Live with us are going to be Vincent Zhang, who's from Georgetown University, Helen Leon, who's from American University, and Emily Brignon, also from American University. Participating with us online will be Ian Kung from William and Mary, also right now in Taiwan, and Aida Guo from Duke University in North Carolina, and Audrey's son, who is with William and Mary. She's in New Jersey right now. So moderating, the presentation is entitled Examining Asian American Hollywood's Favorite Punchline, Examining Asian American Representation in the Media. And the moderator for the event will be Helen Leon. So I'll turn it over to Helen and the team. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Stan. Thanks everyone for joining us today, either in person or live. We have selected 3 different topics today under the umbrella of Asian American representation in the media that we're going to be presenting information on you today. For those of you joining us online, you can ask your questions in the chat box. And for those of you joining us in person, if you could hold all of your questions until the end for our Q&A, we would greatly appreciate that. And without further ado, to begin our discussion on typecasting, we have Ian Kung.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Helen. My responsibility will be primarily to lay out some larger themes to refer to during the discussion to be conducted by my fellow interns by presenting the historical context of typecasting Asians in the media. So to start, we define typecasting as the action of casting an actor in the same kind of role repeatedly. And if there's blame to be placed for the creation and perpetuation of stereotypes about Asian Americans, it is in the media. Stereotypes in general can be positive and negative, but the media stereotypes about Asian Americans are mostly negative, unfavorable, and unflattering. Next slide. The monominority stereotype began in magazine articles in the New York Times Magazine and US News and World Report in 1966, and then spread in different media contexts, such as TV advertising, prime TV series, and Hollywood movies. So here I'll introduce Cultivation Theory, which states that prolonged exposure to media stereotypes might result in the acceptance of the stereotypes as a social reality. Cultivation Theory can be used to describe how media content is linked with the acquisition of stereotypes, because they suggest that the repeated exposure to media stereotypes might lead to the acceptance as a social reality. The theory was initially proposed to examine the effects of violent television, but has been applied to a variety of contexts, such as gender roles and racial stereotypes. So repeated exposure to media stereotypes makes them automatic. Given the similarity and consistency in the portrayal of stereotypes across different forms of media, they might automatically be incorporated into the perceptions of consumers. The role media plays is further accentuated when Asian Americans are heavily concentrated in a few regions, such as California, New York, and Hawaii. So people from other regions might have less direct contact with Asian Americans, and their stereotypes about Asians might be largely cultivated by the media. When it comes to Asian men and women, not only are they underrepresented, but they're also frequently represented in contradictory stereotypical roles. So women either as obedient, hypersexualized dolls or as seductive dragon ladies, while men are portrayed as culturally ignorant, effeminate, and subservient martial artists or villains. But fetishization will be discussed further in the presentation. Media representations have also evolved over time from the clearly negative yellow apparel stereotypes to the deceivingly positive model minority stereotype to suit the changing political, social, and cultural circumstances. But some stereotypes about Asian Americans have remained relatively stable over time. For example, Asians are consistently represented as foreigners who are never American, speak poor English, and lack appropriate social skills. Next slide. To dive further into the model minority stereotype, it might be the most pervasive and dominant stereotype about Asian Americans today. It marked a departure from the previous portrayal of Asian Americans as an invading yellow apparel, which, quote, threatened to undermine the American way of life. The yellow apparel stereotype accentuated the alleged threat posed by the yellow race and led to blatant racial targeting and xenophobia against Asian Americans. Immigrants were once legally excluded and disenfranchised to avoid the white culture being overtaken and outpowered. Since its creation in the mid-1960s, Asians were promoted from being an oppressed racial minority to being a shining example for other racial minorities. Asians are proclaimed as a model minority for their success in education, strong work ethic, freedom from problems and crime, and family cohesion. Asians are also typically represented by the media as. However, studies indicate that media characterization was inaccurate, distorted, and misleading. Scholars have always been skeptical of the unwarranted validity of the stereotype, contending it is only media hype and closer to myth than reality. They also argue that the stereotype was constructed largely out of societal correctness, specifically to silence the charges of racial inequality, to discredit the demands for social justice, delegitimize the protest of racial discrimination, and maintain a racialized social order. The detrimental effects of the stereotype on Asian Americans have been widely reported in various studies. Because commending Asian Americans as a model minority simultaneously disparages other racial groups and downgrades them as problem minorities, Asian Americans were more susceptible to racial harassment, discrimination, bullying, or even violence than other ethnic groups. Research has also revealed that the academic excellence of Asian Americans has tremendous psychological and social costs, such as studying harder and longer, foregoing social life, enduring loneliness, and experiencing extreme depression and stress. Unfortunately, because of the model minority stereotype, these problems go largely unrecognized, and Asian American students receive little institutional support to cope with the problems. Next slide. To provide some empirical evidence of how people have internalized stereotypes that were created and perpetuated by the media, a study published in 2010 found that media stereotypes have influenced the way people perceive and interact with Asians. So in the study, around 170 undergraduate students were asked questions about how likely the answer would be to be a certain ethnicity, given the choices of white, Black, Asian, or Hispanic. For example, they would give a description of a diligent and intellectual student named Jane, who was most likely to be, white, Black, Asian, or Hispanic. Similarly, who was most likely to be left out if you had to invite 4 people to a movie, who you were most likely to seek a friendship with. So these questions showed 4 ways negative media stereotypes have an impact. Asians are perceived as most likely to achieve academic success, perceived as nerds, most likely to be left out, and people are least likely to initiate friendship with Asians and Hispanics. So as implied by these results, there are several main problematic stereotypes that Asians are typecast into. These are model minority, poor communicator, and foreigner. So these results indicate that people's perceptions about Asian Americans are much aligned with the media representations, and stereotypes impact people's interactions. Next slide. Moving on to the yellow apparel stereotype that has been mentioned a few times so far. As the predecessor to the model minority stereotype, it also holds a lot of significance. As the initial stereotype for Asian immigrants flowing into the US, it was constructed in the West and has a longer history than the model minority stereotype. It has been seen to change in meaning and who it refers to over time. Its origins can be traced back to the conquest of Genghis Khan and the invasion of Europe, but still later on, the yellow apparel implied the potential threat from East Asia's large population, China's possible economic power, and Japan's emergence as a key international player. Still later, it came to signify white Americans' fear of Asian migration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Combined with the fear of the size of East Asia and the increasing number of Asian faces in the States, a threat to white America was created that they may be overrun, which led to the exclusion of Asian immigrants and continued American westward expansion into Asia and the Pacific. It should be noted that the yellow apparel can mean not only the threat of the yellow race to the white race, but also all non-white races as a collective cultural threat, as well as economic and political threats to the white race. Next slide. So bringing the past and present together, it has been found that the model minority and yellow apparel stereotype are 2 sides of the same coin. So more recently, scholars argue that the 2 stereotypes are not opposite poles, but instead are inseparable and exist in an intertwined relationship. The yellow apparel embodies a masculine threat to the white Christian culture, while the model minority symbolizes a feminine passivity. In one direction, the model minority mitigates the alleged threat of the yellow apparel, but reversing the direction, the model minority could become the yellow apparel. At a glance, the model minority stereotype seems to be opposite the yellow apparel stereotype in the sense that the former is regarded as positive, whereas the other is negative. But as a quote from a scholarly article I cited says, the model minority has 2 faces. The myth presents Asian Americans as silent and disciplined. This is their secret to success. At the same time, this silence and discipline is used in constructing the Asian American as a new yellow apparel. This leads to an interesting connection between the model minority stereotype and collectivist ideology, which is the most influential racial ideology in the post-civil rights era. Excuse me, it was colorblind ideology. It describes events which, quote, furthers racial power not only through the direct articulation of racial differences, but rather by obscuring the operation of racial power, protecting it from challenge, and permitting ongoing racialization. So the model minority fits this description in that Asian American success is used to deny the existence of institutional racism and to prove that society is fair and open for minority groups to climb up the social ladder. So in summary, On one hand, Asian Americans as the yellow peril embody foreignness and masculinity that threaten the US identity as a white Christian nation. On the other hand, Asian Americans who make efforts to succeed diligently and silently without demanding or protesting symbolize the model minority and femininity. Considering the arguments, it's possible to think that the construction of the model minority stereotype is tied to create a less threatening face of the yellow peril. So that's it for me. I'll now hand you off to Helen, who will discuss the present day implications of typecasting Asian Americans.
All right, Ian, thank you so much. Now to kind of move forward into the present day, I'll be going over some of the more modern implications of typecasting on the Asian American community. So an interesting fact is that Asian Americans represent only 1% of all leading roles in Hollywood, and actually only one actor of Asian heritage has ever won the award for Best Actor, and that's Ben Kingsley, who I have pictured right here. And which is unfortunate because the great thing about media like movies and TV is that they allow you to see yourself in the characters on screen. And when Asian American characters are removed from these stories, it removes a way for you to see and relate to the story. And Asian American leads seeing the complexities of their everyday lives. Because when it gets down to it, Asian Americans face the same struggles as everyone else. They're not others, they're not adjacent. And when you can't see yourself leading everyday life on the screen, it kind of goes to remove you from the greater collective human experience. And seeing these presentations leads to internalized racism and reinforces the model minority myth when the only representation you have on the screen is of a typecast character in negative stereotypes. Like if you only see a stereotype version of yourself, the young people and the next generation think all that they can be is a stereotype because that's what they see on the screen. And if you only see white people as the heroes and the protagonists, it creates a sense of desired whiteness in order to be closer to that hero you see on the screen. Next slide, please. In addition, Asian American actors are often forced to play the same types of characters, like the stereotypes Ian mentioned previously. For men, it's the nerds, it's the assistants, it's doctors. And for women, it becomes more dangerous. The sex workers, the dichotomy of the China doll and the dragon lady, which is either fragile and submissive or mysterious and dangerous. And when Asian actors are cast in these stereotypical roles, it normalizes these stereotypes for Asian people off the screen. And it makes the wider audience think that acknowledging Asian people as these stereotypes is okay. In search of opportunities, actors often are limited to these one-dimensional roles as well. Asian characters are almost always relegated to side roles, and until recently, they were almost never seen as main characters or protagonists. And in order to get a foot in the door, these one-dimensional side character roles are often all that exists for Asian Americans just starting out in the acting business. And typecasting reinforces these negative stereotypes, like I said, and contributes to poor representation of Asian Americans on screen. And this poor representation leads to an inability to relate to on-screen characters and stories in a way that the majority will never have to worry about because they always can see themselves as heroes, as protagonists in stories that they can relate to. Next slide, please. Asian Americans, in addition to only being considered for one type of role, comes with them not being considered for other roles. And Asian stereotypes are often the inverse of the celebrated archetypes like rebels and bad boys, and they're always supporting characters. And Asian faces are seen as not compelling enough to be heroes or protagonists. And I really enjoyed this quote from Thessaly LaForce, which says, "It is only when we are hidden that we are allowed to succeed, which leads to a more troubling but inevitable conclusion. that there is something about the very physiognomy of the Asian face that the American audience still cannot or will not accept. These negative Asian stereotypes do have their roots in yellow apparel, perpetuating the belief that Asian Americans will never truly be American and will never truly belong. And Asian Americans aren't considered for these other roles because it somehow, quote unquote, changes the story. Writer and producer Vinny Chibber says he heard these prejudices in casting rooms where someone might say, well, if you cast a Chinese girl, it'll change the story, which raises the question, why can't stories be told when an Asian American takes the spotlight? And it comes down to a matter of our faces not being seen as quote unquote suitable or palatable to the white audience. And that concludes our segment on typecasting. Next, we're going to discuss tokenism, and leading that discussion in the beginning is going to be Vincent John.
Okay, thank you so much, Helen. Moving on to the second part of this presentation, I'd like to talk a bit about tokenism. Next slide. So, I know you guys might be thinking, how is tokenism different or distinct from typecasting? And I would just like to say that it's important to recognize that the two are essentially two sides of the same coin of marginalization. The two are very closely linked and are instead mostly separated by result and intent. So typecasting is more like the consequence of a filmmaker or director or author, or any sort of creator of media, considering the character and its role, and then casting the Asian American, for example, in the role because it fits a preconceived societal notion of where they belong in a narrative. And on the other hand, tokenism is more so the driving force that recognizes the need for diversity, but nevertheless resorts to the same narrow-minded, short-sighted pigeonholing when it comes to developing that character in the narrative. And this is more recognizable when there is clearly only one Asian American person in a cast who isn't, explicitly representative of a well-defined stereotype, but nonetheless is a minor addition to the full cast. And it's a trend which tends to diminish and reduce such a character to being almost entirely defined by their ethnicity and or race, instead of being defined by key personality traits or characteristics. Like I put on the slide, actors of color that are cast into these roles that reinforce associated stereotypes, they serve as accessories or complements to the main characters, and they almost fulfill a sort of societally expected diversity quota, a diversity quota which serves as a marker of quote unquote good representation only to the majority, and is actually quite performative and perfunctory to minority communities. And as an example, the character Cho Chang from Harry Potter serves as a particularly egregious instance of a character of Asian descent being relegated to an accessory role. She is first the object of Harry's interests. She later becomes frustratingly weak-willed after the death of her love interest, and finally fades into obscurity as the series progresses. Her main purpose in the story is simply to act as a physical metric against which Harry's personal growth can be measured, and also is associated with love and crushes and a sort of romantic interest, which I think Helen and Ian have already taken a deep dive into, and just sort of plays into the idea that Asian women are easily sexualizable. And her name, let's just talk about her name. Harry Potter Wiki, probably the best source for Harry Potter information and trivia, characterizes her name as ambiguously Sinitic and or Korean, which is particularly indicative of a lack of interest on the part of the author J.K. Rowling in fleshing out this character as a believable, concrete Asian American woman. Next slide. So there might be a question on your guys' minds. You might be, or rather a comment. any representation is good representation, right? At least it's better than no representation at all. And well, sure, but should that really be the bar? I mean, that sort of comment is usually a conversation ender when issues of representation are brought up, and it doesn't invite in-depth, more in-depth discussion of the specific impacts of media portrayals, of tokenism, and especially of deceptive representation. And what I mean by deceptive representation, as I've labeled on this slide, is when Asian Americans are cast in roles which don't exactly match their ethnic backgrounds. It really plays into the whole idea of Asian interchangeability, as in just because this actor has or actress has yellow skin, black hair, slanted eyes, they can play someone who's Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Japanese, any sort of ambiguous East Asian ethnicity. And the same thing can apply just as easily to South Asian. Is actually even more problematic and more contentious with the plethora of different ethno-linguistic backgrounds in that region. But for this presentation, I want to draw attention to Lane Kim. For anyone who's watched Gilmore Girls, she's a main character, or not, she's a pretty important character in the show. She is Korean, but her actress, Keiko Agenina, is of Japanese descent. And the actress who plays Lane Kim's mother, Emily Kuroda, is also of Japanese descent. And the times where they speak Korean during the show are infamous for how poor the pronunciation is and how bad the Korean is as a whole. If we could play the clip. This is from season 6, episode 19, I Get a Sidekick Out of You. We are introduced to Lane Kim's grandmother for the first time, who can only speak Korean, and as such, all three of them, Lane Kim, her mother, and her grandmother, are speaking Korean in this scene.
That's your mom's mom?
Yep.
경영아, 선빈이 내려와봐.
I see the resemblance.
이쁘다. 어서 오세요, 할머니. 와주셔서 기뻐요.
여기 오니 너무 좋구나. 얘야, 저거 왜 불상을 방 안에 놓은 거야? 어?
지돈 중이어서요, 어머니.
아우, 이렇게 더럽고 답답하다. 아우, 문 좀 열어.
맞아, 좀 지워야겠다.
야, 너 공항에서 왜 안 나온 거야?
I don't think you need to be able to speak Korean to hear how bad that sounds, right? Like, they didn't sound confident in what they were speaking, and unsurprisingly, why should they? Neither of them are of Korean descent. And it's just mostly a sort of consequence of how interchangeable the producers of the show thought they could make a Japanese actress play as a Korean character. And this wouldn't even be such a big problem, but that episode later turns into a wedding for Lane, and she's dressed in traditional Korean hanbok clothing. And so you're left with this weird situation in which the Korean American community obviously sees this as unideal. Why is a Japanese actress or an actress of Japanese descent playing a Korean character, butchering the Korean language, dressing up in Korean clothing, if you're not even going to make sure she's cast as someone who's Korean? And the Japanese American community watching this is also equally as confused. Why did they go to such lengths to make her so Korean in the show when they could have just as easily not, or casted a Korean American, or taken the Japanese American actress and had her play as a Japanese American character? It really boggles the mind, and it just fails to represent either community well. They're both instead tokenized into an interchangeable role. Next slide. So I've given 2 examples so far, but tokenism of Asian American Pacific Islander actors is incredibly pervasive throughout many eras of American media history. And so I've collated 6 examples of such, and I want to walk through each of them, starting with Lieutenant Logan Lee. I'm sure many of you have seen Top Gun Maverick. It's one of the best movies grossing wise of the past year. But Lieutenant Logan Lee is the prototypical Asian American token. He is part of the squad initially, but doesn't get selected as a candidate for the mission they have at the end. He's also the only Asian American in the squad, and I don't think it's too hard to say that he's probably just a token diversity cast. Mindy from Emily in Paris. This is interesting because Emily in Paris takes place in France, so Asian Americanness is not quite on the top of the producers' minds, but it actually was because she, although she's supposed to be like a mainlander Chinese living in France, but she's played by a Korean American. And not only that, the way she's portrayed in the show is just as an ambiguous Asian American woman. There's no such concrete identity of her as either being from China, having naturalized as a French citizen. She's again that sort of interchangeable, ambiguous role that most Asian Americans find themselves in. Han Su, or Han Zi from Ender's Game, he is again the only Asian in a squad that is primarily white. He mostly serves as an accessory to the main character Ender, and his nickname is literally in the books. His nickname is Hot Soup because it sounds like his name Han Su. I don't think this is at all arguable of sort of token role that is a little bit comical in how it's portrayed. Next, we have Cookie Sanban from Codename Kids Next Door. This is a cartoon that I watched as a child. The premise of the show is that there are sort of like these kids networks all around, and the network she's part of has 5, and she is the only Asian American in a squad, and is again mostly white, which is already a little bit of a yellow flag. However, she is portrayed with a Japanese accent. She's portrayed as a little ditzy, a little carefree, not quite understanding of American cultural concepts. And when she gets angry, she's portrayed as a Japanese oni, which is a sort of like triple whammy of like she is a perpetual foreigner. She is kind of not able to assimilate into American culture. She also somehow still embodies these native Japanese cultural concepts, even though she is supposed to be a Japanese American. It's a very confusing portrayal, in my opinion. Next up, we have Long Duck Dong from 16 Candles, who is, honest to God, probably the worst portrayal of an Asian American in media ever. His name is laughably racist. Every time he appears on screen or has an idea, a gong effect sounds. He has a Chinese accent because of course he does. And his love interest is an athletic student who's taller than him, playing again into the whole emasculated male Asian role. He's perhaps the spitting image of the effeminate, emasculated Asian man. And last, we have Lotus from The Good Earth. And for those of you who might know, this might seem confusing because Anna May Wong, the actress portrayed here, was never actually cast as Lotus. And there's a good reason for that. The Good Earth is about a poor rural Chinese family struggling to get by. But the movie adaptation has an all-white cast. Every single character in that entire movie is white, but they wanted to offer the role of the villainous prostitute to the one Chinese woman. And she, in response, said that it would do immense harm to the Chinese American community if the only villain in the entire movie set in China was the only Chinese woman. So she actually did not accept the role. But I think, again, this is another example of the movie makers and the producers tokenizing her into a sort of sexualized foreign entity. And with that, I'd like to move on to the next part of the presentation, which will be presented by Audrey Sun. She'll continue the conversation of tokenism.
Thank you, Vincent, and hello, everyone. And thank you all for taking the time out of your weekend to come watch us on our presentation. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person, but Emily, Vincent, and Helen seem to be holding the fort down pretty nicely. So, as Vincent said, I will be continuing the conversation on tokenism in mainstream media. And I will first be discussing a recent study that you can see on the screen there. And then I'll talk about some steps we can take and how we can avoid tokenism in the media. And then I'll finish off by doing the opposite and a more positive version of what Vincent just did and giving some examples of accurate and proper representation of Asian Americans in the media. So without further ado, I will get started and discuss this recent study of 2017. It's called Tokens on the Small Screen, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Primetime and Streaming Television. So this study was actually, I think, the third part of a series of studies that I believe was first conducted in 2002. But I will just be focusing on the 2017 study because it is the most recent and applicable to today. Now, this study examined TV shows on all streaming platforms from 2015 to 2016, measured the number of Asian American Pacific Islander series regulars and the way in which they were depicted, whether they were typecasted, as Helen and Ian just discussed, or presented as tokens or fetishized, as Emily and Aida will later discuss. Now, the study found, as we all know from watching television, that the television landscape was heavily dominated by white characters. 64% of all shows at the time did not feature a single Asian American Pacific Islander series regular. So that means only 36% of shows had at least one Asian American Pacific Islander series regular. But even in those shows, the study found that in comparison to their white counterparts, Asian American characters were mostly isolated from the audience. Now, the study defined isolated by meaning that these characters, they didn't have any familial or romantic connections or relationships on the show. And we all know that it's through these familial and interpersonal connections that the audience is really able to engage and sympathize and connect with the characters that they see on television. So they actually found that white characters were 3 times as likely to get these interpersonal connections than Asian American characters. Now, the study also found that on the shows that featured an Asian American series regular, 68% of those shows only had one Asian American. Now, we see this personified on the left here in this quote from Deb Shaw, who played a character in the show Master of None. He says there can be one, but there can't be two, meaning there can only be one Asian American, but there can't be more, or else, the show will suddenly take on a different twist. And it's really become a recurring problem because it allows for producers and casting directors to cast the one Asian American to fill some sort of diversity quota. And then on the chart to the right, we see here under segregated and endangered, we see that shows featuring Asian Americans were often canceled by 2015, thus cutting Asian American representation by 21%, already reducing and minimizing the little amount of screen time that Asian Americans had before. Next slide, please. And so, there we go, thank you. And so even though most of the shows don't avoid tokenism, in fact, embrace tokenism, it isn't too hard to avoid tokenism. And here I'll be going over that. Now, I'm going to start with the bottom of this slide, the quote here from a blogger I found, Alina Chan. And she says, the main difference between tokenism and representation lies in the purpose and execution. Whereas representation seeks to promote inclusion and diversity, tokenism only seeks to achieve an appearance of representation. And so again, this is just outlining what Vincent said earlier, that really the way to avoid tokenism lies in your intent. If you just want to fill a diversity quota, it's much more likely that the characters you cast and portray will be tokens. Now, I just want to take a moment here and acknowledge that tokenism occurs outside of the media, and many of these steps can be used to avoid tokenism in other places, like the workplace or in our own personal and daily lives. So with our first step, when we're talking about the media, you want to cast Asian Americans as lead characters. Now, Vincent went over many, many examples of tokenized Asian Americans, but Again, we see tokens most often in the case of side characters, as the laughing stock of the show. They're used for comedic effect. Mainstream media, we still likes to follow the formula of having an all-white group with one minority or an all-male group with one woman. When tokenism occurs, it's because the writers don't truly care about being inclusive. So they cast the Asian Americans as the side characters to avoid having to do research and avoid having to depict the characters with any real depth. All that matters is filling that diversity quota. On this similar vein, it's also important that writers aren't afraid to cast more than one Asian American. Now, we saw in the previous slide that quote from Dev, there can be one, but there can't be two. It seems to be a common trend that casting directors, producers are afraid to cast more than one Asian American because they don't want the show to take on a different lens. It's as if they're afraid of making the show more Asian, but they're forgetting the part where Asian Americans are a part of the American experience. The best way, or one step to overcome yellow peril and the perpetual foreigner myth, is to embrace Asian Americans as Americans on the television screen. And then the second point on how to avoid tokenism, allow the minority to speak for themselves. Now, sometimes tokenism occurs because as a sort of subconscious effect, the writers are often ignorant of these stereotypes and the effects of typecasting. They're ignorant of how Asian Americans truly lead their lives. So it's important to have the writers be of Asian American descent because it's so much less likely that they will portray the characters as tokens, and it's so much less likely that they'll continue to perpetuate those stereotypes. We all know ignorance leads to the continuation of very harmful stereotypes. And then another step to take is to remember that the character's cultural background is not who they are. By condensing the character into their cultural background, it's almost as if writers are making the character the spokesperson for their culture. We all know one person can't speak for an entire population, and one culture can't be condensed into one person. But at the same time, you can't ignore the character's cultural background. Therefore, writers need to walk a fine line. They need to demonstrate how the character reckons with their Asian American identity, and they also need to ensure that the character isn't solely defined by their heritage. Otherwise, again, writers will drift closer to the danger of perpetuating harmful stereotypes, which leads us to our next and last point: to avoid stereotypes. Now, this whole presentation, we have gone over stereotypes, and we will continue to do so. But again, it is so important to avoid these stereotypes because of the reasons Ian and Helen listed earlier about the modern day implications and consequences of these stereotypes. It continues to cause people to view Asian Americans as the perpetual foreigner instead of, us as real Americans. And next slide, please. But again, it's not that hard. And here we have a few examples of proper Asian American representation that I and my fellow speakers have created today. My personal favorites are Everything Everywhere All at Once and Always Be My Maybe. I've always been a sucker for romance. And then my favorite books on this list are The Joy Luck Club and Free Food for Millionaires. And at the end of this presentation, during our Q&A section, we would love to have you give some recommendations of your own of some proper Asian American representation. And on our website, we also have the Literature and Arts Corner where you can check out some of our other recommendations. So with that, I'll be handing it over to Emily and Aida to talk about fetishization in the media. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you to every presenter before us, and thank you to everyone who helped putting this together. Would not be able to do this without you. Last but not least, thank you to our in-person and virtual audience for tuning in and having this crucial discussion with us. The last topic, our topic of fetishization, will depend on the context and content of typecasting and tokenism as we discuss further. So what is fetishization, one might ask? It is the act of making someone an object of sexual desire based on some aspect of their identity. And for all of US history bleeding into or even magnified in current day, Asians and Asian Americans have been heavily influenced by stereotypes to be fetishized by other groups. Along with other historical developments that contributed to the way Asians are portrayed on screen, Aida and I will dissect other factors that have been and are also impacting the way we view Asian Americans. We will be switching back and forth in speaking, presenting, and examining our section. So thank you to our amazing tech team. Oh, the button. Oh, perfect. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Wei, Mia, for being so supportive and being the true backbone of our events. So yeah, we'll first be discovering the yellow fever. It's interesting how Asian Americans can get labeled or be associated with various and conflicting stereotypes depending on different societal needs and expectations at the time. So the yellow fever itself, the medical term, became associated with Asian Americans because the literal meaning of it is the disease caused by a virus spreading through mosquito bites with symptoms of fevers, chills, and headaches, and sometimes even death. So you can imagine the implications it has when it comes to being in association with a group of people. The association occurred when Asian Americans arrived and they were seen as dangerous, exotic, and here to weaken the white race. We saw the idea manifest clearly in the 1882 Exclusion Act, where white people saw Chinese workers as thieves, stealing jobs, and taking away their opportunity. However, the origin of exclusion and hatred began before 1882.
Yeah, next slide, please. Thank you so much, Emily. So anti-Chinese and Asian sentiment have been expressed through the law before the Chinese Exclusion Act, like Emily said, since the Page Act of 1875. So as previously stated, Asian Americans were always seen as immoral and diseased, and Asian women were particularly stereotyped as subservient and seductive. This was related to the notion in the late 19th century that Chinese women who immigrated to the US were prostitutes, which was heavily imagined by white American men. So you can see that race and gender are heavily associated due to the intersectionality of these two subjects. And for Chinese Americans, while the 1882 Exclusion Act was race-based, its origins began with exclusion of women in the Page Act of 1875, which prohibited Chinese women from immigrating to the US. And this was actually the first restrictive federal immigration law in the United States, and it specifically called the concept of excluding Asian women as ending the danger of cheap Chinese labor and immoral Chinese women.
So why did white American men think of Asian women this way? A cultural literary theorist, Edward W. Said, once coined the term Orientalism in his book by his discovery that bodies of the East are always represented in a particular way. That also basically became a phenomenon that we're seeing even now, where the West and the East are always in opposition. So if the West is seen as strong, masculine, rational, then the East would be seen as weak, feminine, irrational. And it's seen in many modern day scenarios such as politics, but of course, the way we view Asians and Asian Americans physically, character or personality wise.
Next slide, please. So next, Orientalism can then tie into the patronizing attitude of Western nations and the American strong military presence in Asian countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, and Korea. So one infamous scenario was the Korean military comfort woman, in which during the Korean War, women from South Korea and across Asia served as prostitutes for American soldiers. And some survivors can be seen in the picture on the right here. There were also specific incidences where American soldiers stayed at camp towns for entertainment, where the prostitution of Korean women was allowed, but dating these Korean women was not. And this continued to the era of the Cold War. And you can see on the left in this slide how the US described Korean mothers as obsessed with blood purity or being too poor. And this eventually manifested in Asian representation within TV propaganda that compared adopting to charity and falsely claimed all Korean mothers were prostitutes. So this can further exemplify how the objectification and fetishization of American women from film and representation can lead to heavy consequences on an international scale. Next slide, please.
So what are the implications of these stereotypes? So when we see a masculine body of someone Asian, we see them as feminine. And if it's already feminine, then it's hyper feminine. The tropes of Orientalism shapes the way Asian women are perceived, part of the same force that emasculates Asian men. That serves the white supremacy, all the stereotypes around Asian men with a long history of misogyny. Plus, as we know now, many K-pop stars and groups are also being fetishized by fans, and a lot of them are male stars. The beauty standards are then affected by these implications as well, the Western beauty standard versus Eastern beauty standards, which ties in the topic of appropriation, which we will not be getting into, but definitely something to think about and might be discussed later on with our Q&A session. Next slide, please. So we want to talk about steps to avoid fetishization and the way we see Asian people in the media. So we want to identify, differentiate, and combat these issues. So there is a difference between physical preference and fetishization, because that's something that people bring up often. Oh, this is not fetishization, this is just a physical preference. People have preferences, and yes, it's a matter of taste, but when you project a personality, a behavior, a stereotype on that person or even the entire group that they belong to, you are fetishizing because it's an obsession that probably does not even apply to that person. You only see this person as a tool to satisfy your intentions, and you're turning that person into your own fantasy and not really seeing them as a complex, multi-layered human being, and only liking the idea of them. So to bring up an example, if someone says, oh, my preference is someone who has dark hair, who is very tall, then obviously that's a physical preference, because multiple groups, like a lot of people resemble with those traits. However, if you say, oh, I specifically like Asian women who are submissive, who will always do what I say, who don't speak up when they want to. Also, the fact that they have black hair, tan skin, then that's when it becomes very problematic and resorting to the stereotypes that contribute to this phenomenon. Inappropriate films and plays that have contributed to the Asian fetishization and cause harm, therefore should be avoided. This one is one example, but also the two are on the other slide. But basically, these are all films that center on the white male subjectivity, the fantasy of what the Asian female body is. And these all minimize women into seductive, quiet, exotic, and disposable objects by stripping values and individuality away from them. So it is not just a compliment. And we cannot excuse violence as sex addictions.
Yeah, exactly. And these further implications could be seen at the Atlanta shootings in March of 2021, where 8 people were murdered and 6 of those were Asian women. And in this instance, the perpetrator told the police he was motivated by a sex addiction, indicating the correlation of Asian women-run businesses with sex work. And while he claimed it was not race-related, there was a lot of upheaval from Asian American communities with a lack of charge from police and government, because these larger systems of white supremacy have played into the oppression and fetishization of Asian people, especially those who lie at the intersections between different marginalized communities like Asian women. And by dismissing and excusing his history, misrepresentation, and their implication, it leads to even more violence against Asian people, with statistics such as 68% of the anti-Asian hate incidents reported between March of 2020 and March of 2021 being against Asian women.
Have to say about our presentation. We're going to open up to Q&A now. And so we'll gather around and talk about some things that you guys want to talk about after our presentation. So thank you so much.
So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And thank you, Mr. Zhao, for the link you dropped on the model minority research.
Our in-person or online audience wants to just say to get the discussion rolling. Anyone have any thoughts, any other topics they want to address? Yes, go ahead.
So first of all, amazing presentations. Like very clearly you guys have worked really hard on this and it shows. Second, I'm wondering, especially about the like earlier, I think in the first presentation, you guys were talking about the yellow peril stereotype. Do you see the influence of that in like current like media coverage of China and like political like relations with China in particular, or if that falls outside the scope of?
Yeah, no, we definitely don't mind talking about that. If you guys don't mind, I can go first, and if you guys want to chime in. Yeah, I definitely see yellow peril in regards to like current media coverage of China. There's a lot of, China is an economic threat, especially that's what you see the most of, but then it turns into a little bit more of people seeing as a cultural threat. Including a lot of fear mongering about like new world wars or going to war with China, which doesn't help exacerbate anti-Chinese attitudes. And you see a lot of that with, Chinese Americans get their loyalty questioned, and a lot of people, like when they try to have, just discussions about their identity, a lot of the times it gets derailed to talk about China, or like let's make it about like Chinese politics. And a lot of it comes from just, they're trying to like, they're not, a lot of like questions about yellow peril and like China to Chinese Americans are not in good faith. A lot of it I see is definitely about trying to like spark controversy. If you guys have anything else to say.
Yeah, I'll go first. I think talking about stereotypes previously, I think this goes really well in terms of how a lot of Chinese Americans, I know from my personal experience talking with my friends, that a lot of people associate China directly with them, even though China is a country and a lot of them are born in the US, but somehow they're always being questioned about their identity, even though even me, like I don't know everything about China yet. I'm always questioned with very interesting aspects of what's going on in China, and specifically asking about Chinese politics and saying, oh, back to the stereotypes again, really resorting to what they think we believe in, what we think we know. And so I definitely see that very prevalent in just current day, any kind of relationship, like when it comes to friends, or even in classrooms, like professors sometimes even looking at you when it comes to talking about China or just East Asian politics. They kind of rely on you for politics that you might not even know about, because what if your specialization is in a different region, but because you appear a certain way, people kind of expect things from you. And so that's an interesting aspect that I've witnessed.
I think also going off of that, we can see how Yellow Peril has translated sort of to the modern day Asian invasion kind of myth and thoughts that's been going around, especially like for us as college students. We see people talking about how there are too many Asian Americans on college campus and how we're overrepresented. And then in the workforce, that notion that Asians are here to steal our jobs, when it's just not the case, and it causes very harmful implications. So yeah, it seems that Yellow Peril's never really gone away. It's just gotten a new name.
And just to sort of piggyback up Audrey's point, this kind of systemic, pervasive cultural perception of Asians has, of course, evolved and changed over time. And I think one of the most interesting ways in which it has manifested in today is that there's this sort of technological aspect to Yellow Peril. Like there's enough of this that it can be considered its own sort of dimension, where we see fears of like Huawei taking over US telecommunications as like the largest telecommunications provider in the world. We see fears of US intelligence agencies constantly being like, China is like stealing our technology, stealing our patented sort of American developed technology. And this, like, there have been several instances where Chinese scientists, or I should say Chinese American scientists, so American scientists of Chinese origin, were falsely accused of having ties to China and let go from their jobs, fired from their positions because of false accusations, because of this entire notion that China is not only a cultural and economic threat, but also a sort of technological rival to the US. And of course, this person is Chinese, they must be secretly a spy for China. There's enough of this sort of technological, I guess, like almost too tragic how like the advancement of technology has just provided another dimension to this sort of Yellow Peril rhetoric.
Okay, so we've got some questions from our live stream, so we're going to go ahead and look at some of those. From Elizabeth Berry, we have, were the topics that you covered, e.g. tokenism, fetishism, new information for you? Or was it something that you discussed with your families? And was it something that you've talked about throughout your life to help prepare you for the world? Or was it something that you became more aware of as you progressed through life and with this internship? I can start. Personally, for me, I have never really talked about these topics with my family or anyone. Really not until I started university did I actually give more complex thought to this, because I had never grown up seeing anyone like me on the TV screen. And honestly, I really didn't think much of it. I just remember that, this is like strange. In fact, I always thought, because I myself am mixed, I thought I was going to grow up to be a white person. So maybe that had something to do with it. But personally for me, like these topics came to me more as I was older and I started to have more critical thoughts about the media I did consume.
I'll go next. I feel like everyone has a very different experience when it comes to learning about these concepts, because it depends on your living journey. Like where you have lived, what media you consumed. For me personally, I grew up in China actually, even though I was born here. So the media I consumed was obviously like Chinese media. And so I actually felt very disconnected a lot of times because they're not portraying me as someone who is mixed as well. I not that I felt out of place, but I didn't think much of it as well. Maybe it's because I was younger too, but when I moved back to the US, I definitely saw the lack of representation in general of Asian Americans. And it was always in the back of my head, but I never thought much about it until I started doing research, coming to AU, and actually be able to talk about these things with people who actually care about these issues too. And I think just having more conversations like today will actually advance this acknowledgement, the realization of a lot of the issues we're facing to the younger generation, because I think more exposure is better. So that way, when children grow up in America from the AAPI communities are able to see themselves in the media and being able to feel empowered by the community and by us.
Yeah, I just want to echo off Emily because I feel like you brought up a really interesting point with growing up in China, because I do have family in China who has a very like different perspective of representation. Just like we mentioned, like Asian American representation is like very different from like Asian representation, right? And so like I remember the first time I kind of started paying attention to this topic was when like Crazy Rich Asians came out. I think it was like I was like old enough, and it was a whole cast of Asian people, so there was a lot of like noise around it and media hype. But yeah, I think like we had very different perspectives because they didn't understand, my family didn't understand why it was like so different for me to see Asian Americans represented on screen, and how our like lived experiences are actually like super different.
Question here from Julian Hector. What role do you think that TV producers / writers can do to portray the diverse experiences that Asian Americans face and the different cultures they come from?
I feel like the progression right now, the trajectory of AAPI representation is definitely a good sign. Seeing how much we're portrayed and how accurately we're being portrayed now definitely makes me feel very confident in the future that people in the writing room are going to be able to care for us in the way that they never did before. I don't remember where I got this statistic from, but because of the fact that Asian Americans are showing up to theaters in person, it's actually helping people in Hollywood to recognize that, oh, we need to care about these communities because we want more revenue, and ties in with the topic of capitalism actually. But it also helps us in the way that I did it before, where they're actually caring about talking about our stories and displaying our stories on screen in the theater. And I think in the future, in terms of how to keep doing what we're doing, is to not only highlight specific like generational stories, immigrant stories, specific API stories, but also just having more characters, like regular characters as API members. Like I feel like that's something that we're really lacking. And also hinting at like the fact that they are different in the way that they have unique backstories, backgrounds that should be highlighted in a TV show, a movie, etc., because they don't share the same experience as a white person does. And so, yeah, that's something that I would love to see in the future, is just have people from the AAPI communities represented in media in a regular way, like, because it goes back to like the cycles of normalization. Like once we're finally normalized in the media, I think that's when we truly feel equally represented.
Yeah,
I think-
and if I can just say Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. But I think also going off that point, just having like writers and producers recruiting other writers and producers of the cultural background that they're hoping to represent. One example that popped in my head was the new Marvel show, Miss Marvel, about a Pakistani American girl and her superhero journey. The writers of that show are, in fact, I believe, of Southeast Asian heritage and South Asian heritage. And so it's just sort of, so it's not doing what they did with the live action Mulan, where all the writers were white, but and all the actors were Asian. We need representation both behind the screens and on the screen.
Emily and Audrey were saying, I think it's important for all those involved in the production stage to just actually talk to Asian Americans and not just other people in the industry as well, but just, you know, their friends or like just people they see, or just to get a greater body of experiences than what just might be close to them or that they see. I just think it's important that before making any like production decisions, it's important that you're 100% confident that this is an accurate presentation, and that you just make sure that like what you're doing is believable and it lines up with what, like, for a character written for a show, like this character has a believable story, and it's not just like a mishmash of stereotypes or like inaccurate accents or inaccurate casting.
I just wanted to get one more. Sorry. If the echo goes away, hopefully. But yeah, I wanted to make this point minute before in one of our previous meetings, but obviously the end goal, as I agree with representation, accurate representation, appreciation for is the end goal, but it doesn't have to be. I graduated now, but he said that all you really need is the small things to get people to like try Chinese school snacks. That makes them easy to accept, and something like give them a good show, a Chinese New Year parade. Examples are already happening. Producers are already taking action, like in kids shows. I don't know if you guys are familiar with We Bare Bears or a show called Craig at the Creek, but they're already showing these treats from Asian cultures and doing it with enthusiasm, so that not only the kids but the adults can see a kids show and Asian culture being appreciated. So I guess that should be a first step on the way to the road.
Groups within the Asian American community, Southeast Asians, South Asians, Pacific Islanders, in terms of working towards creating better visibility for these diverse communities in the media.
I think that's a very good question. I think I was the first one to bring up the label of AAPI. I think it's very important to acknowledge that every ethnic group is very different. They struggle with different things. But like you said, in terms of creating that solidarity, it's really important for these diverse groups to come together and really advocate and fight for each other and together. And that's why I usually use API, the label API, to describe certain things, because I think in a sense we struggle a lot of the same stereotypes in terms of always being a label as Asian just because of the way we appear to other people and stuff like that. And so, and did you ask about like ways of combating? Sorry, I just, could you clarify the last question?
Yeah, I guess just representation of Asian Americans is already such a difficult issue, but how, I guess, can we work together to make sure that that representation is, I guess, truly representative of also underrepresented groups within the Asian American, and if you're going to include Pacific Islander communities?
Yeah, I think it's important when we talk about representation, we talk about specifically like what kind of representation too, because a lot of times when even in the presentation we had, we were talking specifically about East Asian representation. And so I think having more Asian representation in terms of every sector, like every kind of Asian American and Pacific Islander is very important, because when we talk about the increase of Asian American representation in the media, we're not necessarily including Pacific Islander experience and representation. And that's something very important to know in general, not just for our presentation, but also outside of it too, that they are not getting a lot of spotlight. And that's something that we need to advocate for as well. I think it's just really important to showcase all kinds of representation, basically, from different groups, because every group is very different. They share different cultures, values, backgrounds. And so I think it's very important in the future to really highlight different groups and going outside the bubble of what we see now, which is like Chinese American representation. So yeah, I don't know if that completely answers the question, but I hope that answered part of it at least.
Just a maybe quick example of, I think, some media that does this well. One of our other interns, Elizabeth, who had just asked a question previously, brought up a show called Craig of the Creek, a Cartoon Network show, which has been like notably praised for its like rich amount of cultural and ethnic diverse representation, from Pakistani Americans to, I believe, like Ethiopian Americans. There's so many different characters of the show that come from very grounded, but I guess you could say oftentimes overlooked backgrounds. And I think maybe a kind of I need to be specific here. The cartoon format works well for this because it is able to introduce such a wide variety of characters without much sort of production cost. It's like, animation as opposed to finding actual people. Not to say that having actual people of like, Hmong descent, of like Burmese descent wouldn't be also ideal, but in terms of first steps to sort of normalizing, right, the idea of like, oh, there are more than just Chinese, Korean, Japanese Americans. There are also like Laotian Americans, there are Bengali Americans, there are Americans of every single Asian Americans of a wide array of cultures. That cartoon and the sort of format of introducing, I guess, as many sort of diverse characters as possible is a good step towards that.
Great. So we've got another question online from Lauren Ng. On Crazy Rich Asians, I've heard a lot of different perspective on its representation from my Asian American friends. What do we all think of the representation from Crazy Rich Asians?
Yeah.
I don't mind. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to actually touch on that because I was thinking of that question from the last conversation we were having. So yeah, I think like Crazy Rich Asians definitely focuses on a very like specific class of Asian Americans, and definitely much more like East Asian representation. And I think just like overall, yeah, like East Asian representation, specifically like Chinese and Korean and Japanese American representation. I think recently there's been a lot of examples of it, but just like we mentioned before, there's so many other different communities within the label AAPI that are not represented at all. And it goes further than, just race, but also like, what about queer communities or adoptees or people who are refugees? Like I've barely seen any examples of those things. So yeah, like while Crazy Rich Asians, I think that was a very like different experience for a lot of people, because it was like one of the first cases where there's like a full Asian American or Asian cast. But at the same time, I feel like there was definitely a lot of places where it wasn't very relatable for like most people. And yeah.
Oh, Helen, we can't hear you.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Yeah, so I was saying, I definitely agree with what Aida was saying about how it's good representation from seeing a lot of Asian people being involved with the production and the cast, but also you have to keep in mind that Crazy Rich Asians is definitely about a very specific group of Asian people. And like Aida was saying, it's enjoyable to watch, but it's probably not going to be relatable for a lot of Asian Americans, but it's definitely good to see more Asian American, East Asian faces on the screen, while keeping in mind that, of course, most Asian Americans are the Singaporean elite super rich. All right, so we've got another question here from Ricky Mui. What are some recommendations for Asians to, for example, fund an Asian TV channel, much like BET? And what might be some recommendations for Asians seeking political office to better connect with Asian populations and other cultures?
So I don't think I'm very qualified. Oh, there's an echo. Okay. I don't think I'm very qualified to answer this question, but I will say to fund an Asian TV channel, I would love to see one of those. I would love to watch one. And I think that would be up to the Asian Americans who are in the film, television, media industry. And then for seeking recommendations for Asian Americans in political office to better connect with Asian populations and other cultures, I think there are already some Asian Americans in political office that I'm sure you all could reach out to start networking and connecting. But I think one example of something not really to do, me personally, I wasn't a huge fan of Andrew Yang's marketing and the way he tried to reach out to the Asian American community and connect with them. I think his slogan was math when he was running for president, which sort of just really perpetuated the model minority stereotype and the idea that Asian Americans are just like the nerds that you don't want to talk to. But that was my own experience.
Yeah, I completely agree. And second question, like to better connect with Asian populations, I guess just like focusing on issues that Asian Americans actually care about. So whether that be like immigration, like it was mentioned a lot today in like the presentation, or just like language access, like stuff like that. Like providing or focusing on those issues and making sure you're actually making the effort to connect with Asian Americans. I think that's a great first step, at least.
Helen, we can't hear you again.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, like I was saying, thanks guys for asking all these great questions. Unfortunately, we do only have time for one more question. So I'm going to read this one from Adam Bubenik. What impact do you think that media from Asia, for example, K-dramas, K-pop, Danmei, etc., have on non-AAPI audiences, and how Asian Americans see themselves? Do they further the idea of Asian Americans as foreigners, or do they provide a wider berth of experiences and representation of what Asian Americans can be? All right. Wei, go ahead.
Do you want me to hold the phone?
No.
I just want there.
Yeah, I just have a quick answer to that. I was just thinking about this the other day. So the Chinese American author Ken Liu, he's best known for a series of short stories, The Paper Menagerie, and then also for translating the Three Body Problem, the whole series, well, 2 of the books. But he's recently come out with a series of what he calls silk punk fiction. So it's fantasy fiction, but typically when we think about like fantasy as we read them when we're children, a lot of it is medieval based. If you think, think about the dress, you think about the knights and the princes and the queens and the kingdoms and all of that, and all the dragons. So he's writing fantasy, but drawing from Chinese folklore and Chinese elements, Chinese culture, East Asian culture. And it's not explicitly Chinese. If you read his novel, the first one, The Grace of Kings, none of the names are explicitly Sinophone, and none of them are even explicitly Asian. But to me, what was so powerful about the series was that he didn't highlight this as like, look, I'm doing fantasy from an East Asian point of view. He's just saying, look, I'm doing fantasy with different elements than people are used to. So to answer sort of the question and echo the second part of the question, yes, I think it provides more just a wider view, wider perspective, wider lens from which to imagine a fantasy world, not just from King Arthur or any, I've read so much fantasy growing up, and it was really a lot of it was just Arthurian legends turned into whatever version. So look him up. So, and then just, I think he coined the term silk punk. It hasn't really taken off, but I wanted to take off because it's just so cool. It's like off like steampunk and whatever. So, okay, I'm done.
Thank you. Hey, it's good. Great presentation, and really hats off to all of you, the ones that are here, Vincent, Helen, and Emily, and those who are online with us here, Audrey and Ian and Aida. Okay, thank you very much. It was a great conversation. I think it can go on. It presents a lot of age-old questions. I think the oldsters like Ted and me have experienced, but it's great to hear a point of view coming from a younger audience and younger participants. Great research on subjects that are really need to be open, but we need to be more open about. And I'm glad that you all took the time to do this, and I enjoyed it very much, and I thank the audience, the live audience, for coming here. Just a few in number here, but just a great audience. Thank you for being here and taking the time to be here. And I thank our virtual audience. And now I want to let our executive director of 1882 Foundation, who's done a great job in promoting our culture here, 1882 Foundation. So Ted Young, who's executive director.
So I want to thank everyone again for coming and so forth. This is the first of our return to the center to try to get back into live programming and so forth. So you guys are the little rabbits in the testing, and we had some glitches. So sorry I wasn't here at the beginning. I'm sure Stan did a great introductory remarks, but I hope that you can continue to come. Our goal is to have one talk story event once a month. But this month we have about 3 or 4, right? So be sure to come to the next one. Do you know what the next schedule is? It's on a Tuesday or something.
Well, no, I think the next one's going to be this coming Sunday, next week from today. It's
a week from today.
Our
Our goal.
Education.
Oh, okay, great.
K through 12.
Yeah, so we have a subunit of interns working with Tingy, a great person that does a lot of education programs with us. stay tuned if you're interested in that. Also stay working with us. And that will be Sunday, Wednesday, Sunday from here. Same time. We tried to do it on Sundays. Parking is a little bit better. Air conditioning not so great, but and that's the problem. They program the hours, and then the guy who's programming is not really in the building. So today there was a little bit of a glitch. I'm sorry you guys had to sort of wander around, and Stan and I was wandering around quite a bit too. But they try to do a great job, and I want to appreciate the fact that Gold Properties, which own this place, provides this place pro bono for us, because it's part of their commitment to being part of the community, and I appreciate that very much. So we'll be having other things, and I'm so glad. How many? I just want to take a quick show of hand. How many guys are from Vincent's Georgetown? Yeah. How many from American University Project Ponyo guys?
That's right.
Hey, that's a group there. That's a group. How about from George Washington?
Well,
Other places? Where else? Other places? Where are you?
Chicago.
Chicago. Wow, so great. Come all the way from Chicago. No, but I think that one of the things we're going to try to do, and I hope Vincent, you and your people over there at George Washington get together. I'm hoping that we get more interns, young people, to talk about Asian American programs within our DMV. So the question always comes up over the years is it possible? You know, University of Maryland has an Asian American Studies program, but neither of the other three universities around here have a program per se. They have the courses and so forth. So over the years, Stan and I have been doing this with students, and everybody asks, is there a way that we could just sort of like combine classes or coordinate classes, get some kind of shared credit program going? But in that same process, as we do our intern programs such as this, I think one of the really good aspects of these type of intern programs, you have a chance to meet each other. You can see the diversity that's represented within the Asian American community. You can exchange ideas like you're doing here. And I'm hopeful that as we do these programs for the next couple of months or something that are actually geared and designed by our interns, that you guys also come and join in. And I put Vincent in the spot because he got us connected with some people, and I think it'd be wonderful. I'd love to hear more about programs. Like, tell us as a group, what is Project Ponyo actually doing? What are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish in that forum? I'd like to hear more about what the Asian American programs are going on at George Washington, as well as in Georgetown. And maybe each of you guys can make a presentation, and then we would sponsor you all here, and we could share cookies and punch and stuff like that. But mostly you can share each other's experience and do things together. And hopefully, maybe at some point, we could bring in some other people to talk about how do we create an Asian American Studies program that is shared among the three universities in DMV. I think that would be something that you can leave a lasting legacy for the rest of you, for your other students to come. So again, thank you so much. I want to thank Wei and Mia. One of the give them a hand. One of the things that we really learned during the 2 or 3 years of the pandemic in which we didn't meet was that the Zoom function, the digital function, has so many opportunities and ways of doing things, but it misses one thing. And that one thing has been the core of what Talk Story has been about, is that we come together to share stories so that we can, by the sharing of the stories and interacting with each other, our community is strengthened. Our identity is reinforced and our community is strengthened. And you can't do that very well on a webinar, Zoom type thing. That becomes more like a lecture, talking head type stuff. But this is where things are good, where you guys can talk to each other afterwards. We usually leave about half an hour or an hour sometimes to just mingle. And that's what we like about trying to return to this sort of like in-person thing. So our programs will probably now all be hybrid. And this is where Wei and me are trying to figure out how to do that. How do we interact? Personally, we know how to do that, but how do we do that over the air? So if you guys have ideas how we can do that, then be sure to join our team. Our team's always looking for fresh blood. And we're very informal. And so I want to thank you all for coming. Bring forth your ideas, bring forth your stories. Everyone has a story. And when you share it, that makes it worthwhile for all of us. So again, thank you. And thank you guys on the internet. I know I recognize all you guys are all coming back. So let's continue doing that. Look forward to seeing you in the next program.